So this is a collaboration between myself, my colleague John Jerram from the Institute of Education in London, and also Jake Anders, who's an economist from the National Institute of Fiscal and Something Studies. Do you know what it is, Felicia? National Institute of Economic and Social Studies, I think?
No.
I don't know.
We do that now.
Nice, something, whatever. Anyway, so it really is a multi-disciplinary team, and that comes through, really a lot of the theoretical framing is from sociology, with people like Glenn Elders. The statistical approach is borrowed from econometrics, and the outcome variables of interest are quite clearly psychological.
So what do we have a good input from half the people in the center or in the institute?
Yes. So what I'm looking at here is the impact of the global financial crisis or the Great Recession, if from the US or the UK, and this was triggered in about 2008-ish, 2009-ish by the subprime mortgage collapse in the US. Which led to a whole bunch of negative things. And there has been some research from the UK, for instance. One of Robert Putnam's teams has been doing a lot of work in the UK and the US about the various negative effects this has had on things like pro-sociality and those sorts of interesting topics. But here I was interested in the effect on multi-dimension is probably the wrong word. Multi-domain is probably better. Well-being. For young people. So, a bit of context. In 1960s, I think it was, C. Wright Mills wrote an entire book critiquing, damning the social sciences for its lack of focus on context. And in the opening chapter, he says a line, something along the lines of, you can't understand history without understanding individual personality, but you also can't understand individual personality without understanding the historical context. And so that book really set the stage for a series of researchers, particularly in the area of developmental science, so developmental sociology, developmental psychology, looking at how does the idea of temporal, like big historical events, impact the way people live, develop, etc. And so the two biggest probably names in this area is Bronfenbrenner, who's a big monster name in developmental psychology, so big that now you can't publish anything using his name because everybody's a bit like that's old hat now. And also Glenn Elder. And we'll go into a little bit of what Glenn Elder had to say about the Great Depression a little bit later. But after Glenn Elder, outside of the guys at Cornell University, there's been a bit of a stuttering in relation to research that is really focused on this really big contextual type events on individual development. But in the last couple of years, and Rich Ryan got me onto this, there's been an interplay in psych science looking at the effect of the global financial crisis on things such as, for example, narcissism, with the claim that the global financial crisis gave rise to a big decline in narcissism, though that research was a little suspect. And the reason that it was suspect is that, and probably the reason why that this research isn't done maybe that much, is it has a lot of methodological difficulties. Most of this research is done by using cross-sectional data. So taking multiple cohorts, so for instance the General Social Survey in the US and a few others where it's looking for studies that have a large age range but multiple birth cohorts. So for instance you can get 18-year-olds at different periods in history. But really there was a paper in Psych Science recently this year that said really to be able to do this research you need to have longitudinal data. But the problem is that you need to have longitudinal data in which an event happens right in the middle, and of course that's quite hard to plan. But luckily in Australia we were lucky to have the LSAE database, which straddled the the global financial crisis quite well. So why is the global financial crisis interesting? Well, you know, big economic events like this are incredibly hard to predict, and so they allow us to look really at natural experiments in which, you know, the whole population can experience a decline in living standards. And so it's a really nice natural experiment to see what happens when, you know, resources are removed. How does that affect people's personalities and, you know, other psychological traits? But it doesn't necessarily have to be the global financial crisis. The most famous work in this area is a book by Glenn Elder called Children of the Great Depression. And he looked at well-being amongst many other things and looking at children who were born around the Great Depression, children that were born before the Great Depression, children that were born after, and looked at how their relative birth cohorts differed in a whole range of things. Quite a famous book. The 20th anniversary edition was released a couple of years ago. It's a nice read. But it's not the only thing that in this area. So Bob Cummins' group from Deakin University has also looked at things like the SARS outbreak in China and Hong Kong. And so looking, for example, at what impact that had on well-being. But for Australia, it might seem odd to look at the global financial crisis because the claim pushed here quite a lot was that we escaped it. We didn't have a technical recession. However, we did have problems. And so I think this single graph shows it quite well. In the blue is Australia and the US, just to show that, you know, we didn't have it as bad, but we did have it bad, is the US. And you see that just here, there's a dramatic increase in youth unemployment that is just, you know, a vertical increase. And this has happened right at the period of the global financial crisis, a dramatic increase in youth unemployment. So, you know, there is something definitely to look at here. There is, you know, almost from you can almost see an experimental kind of framework coming out here. So why am I focusing on youth? Well, I'm not just focusing on youth because youth unemployment was particularly affected, but also because it's a period in which we could think of it being an area of vulnerability. So I know that some of you have read Steinberg's recent book, and he talks a lot about this period between the ages of about 10 and 25 being one in which we have both a lot of biological changes going on, but also a lot of social and cultural changes. So my colleagues and I had a paper in DevPsych a couple of years ago where we talked about this idea of phase adequate engagement. And so we talked about the period of about between 17 and 22 as being particularly critical. And the reason it was particularly critical was that there seems to be a huge number of developmental tasks that happen at this period. They happen from lots of different domains, you know, relationship, work, education, political views. Lots of things go on around this time that kind of covers the whole aspect of people's lives. And so it's a particularly vulnerable period, this age from about 17 to 22. Also, this period, if things go off track here, it can have long-running implications. So Jasper and I had a paper that was recently published where we showed that people that take a gap year, it can have negative impacts going further. And we cited some research from the UK which showed that even going into 30s and 40s, that people that took a gap year were worse off in terms of wages, even though on average they graduated with better degrees. One of the things that's quite interesting also that before doing this research I hadn't really thought about is also the idea of birth cohort competition. So in economics, one of the things that's really interesting was that to show how, for example, if a birth cohort is very large, if lots of people are born at a particular time, that tends to be associated with lower well-being because there's more competition for educational and employment prospects. So it is perhaps not surprising then to see that baby boomers are regularly shown to be those that have the lowest levels of well-being. because it's the biggest birth cohort. But also, you know, from a more nuanced perspective, there's a fair bit of research that shows, for example, that during the global financial crisis, that coming out of that now, those people that made decisions around that time, so for instance, they may have decided to, okay, it's really important that I stay in the labour market, so I might go work at Walmart even though I have a degree in economics or whatever, that they will find it incredibly hard to get back on track into the positions they originally wanted to fill, because employers were seeing the fact that they went off tangent as a negative. Now, admittedly, a lot of these people had done the best that they could, but they were being outcompeted by younger people that hadn't had to make those sacrifices. Okay, so well-being and change. I won't dwell on this because you guys know this pretty well. There's quite a long-running hypothesis in psychology, but increasingly in economics as well. This idea that well-being is generally pretty stable, that you know, events can move it up or down, but it remains pretty stable. However, there's two challenges to that. The first is, if you take a lifespan perspective, it seems to be, though what the cause of this is unknown, it could be birth cohort rather than development, is that there's a U-shaped trajectory, essentially that well-being declines to about the age of 40 and 50 before it picks up again. Having said that, there is some recent research which tries to disaggregate age, period and birth cohort and suggesting that U-shaped trajectory may actually be birth cohort related rather than development. But the other interesting thing is that if we look at critical life events, this idea that a lot of us have, that you win the lottery, you bounce up and come back down, that actually differs depending what the critical life event is. And so we touched on this last week, but some events, and in particular unemployment, is one of those events in which well-being doesn't ever really recover. And so that there's this idea that economic conditions can have a pretty big impact on well-being, and that impact can be long-term. And so from that perspective, it is quite interesting to leverage off some of these natural experiments that can happen in the real world to see, you know, what might we expect from economic downturns and the way it affects people long-term.
Phil, is the economic effect, is that partially because they never recover economically, or is the well-being down even when they recover economically?
The well-being is down even when they recover. So there are multiple spells of unemployment is bad, but even those that find work even relatively quickly, the well-being still stays down. So one of my favourite shows, Community. So I'm looking here mainly at a multi-domain perspective of well-being. Why am I doing that? Well, largely because the only data set that covered this period measured it this way, but I didn't say that in the paper. Instead, what I said was that there's relatively little research on the differential effects of individual and societal crisis on well-being. So, you know, for those of us who are keen on self-concept, we know that there's very little correlation between math and English self-concept, for example. And so perhaps it's a little naive or silly just to say that general life satisfaction is a be-all and end-all measure. Maybe we should be looking at happiness and satisfaction and those sorts of things in different areas of people's lives. And so that begs the question then, well, which domains would we expect to be most affected? And I think one of the surprising findings coming out of the research in the UK and the US was the thing that was really highly affected was things like community and social trust and these kind of interpersonal aspects of well-being that were particularly affected by the global financial crisis. So there's quite decent research which shows that volunteering declined quite dramatically during the global financial crisis. But not just that, there's also some questions in some of the big surveys that we're looking at. For example, you know, how likely would you be to lend your neighbour a cup of sugar? And those sorts of involuntary aspects of pro-sociality also declined during the global financial crisis, which has interesting implications for some of the UK political stuff going on about big society, but I won't get off track. So from that perspective, we might expect some of the social aspects of well-being to be particularly affected. So in this paper, basically we had these following hypotheses. They were that the global financial crisis would have a significant on well-being. We had a little side point to this. We asked, can cash counter this? So in economics, they always like to put a price figure on things. And so previous research on recessions in the 1990s suggested that if we gave every person in the community, I think it was about $580, that we could offset the negative effects of recession on well-being. And our government, in whatever you think of what they did, provided 80% of people and 90% of households with a cash payment, which translates into 2008 US dollars to be around $600, so a little more than what these economists were suggesting. So we have the question to say, well, can cash counter the negative effects? We're also interested in the fact of, does the effect of the global financial crisis differ by developmental stages? So in our model of phase adequate engagement, we suggested that the age, that post-high school transition period where it's, the end of teenagehood, the beginning of the 20s is particularly vulnerable. And so because of the design of the studies we were looking at, we could compare 19-year-olds and 22-year-olds. And the suggestion was that based on our research on phase adequate engagement, that age 19 would be the age that was more affected. We also wanted to have a research question to say, was there evidence of differential effects on different life domains? Remembering that we thought, maybe it's the social areas that are also relatively affected. So, the data. We had 4 cohorts of the longitudinal study of Australian young people. These were birth cohorts of 1981, 1984, 1987, and 1990. And so, almost 40,000 kids over 12 years. So, big lots of data. The next question we had to ask is that we were going to use some econometrics models, which we'll look at in a little bit. But these rely on identifying a natural experiment. And so the question was to say, well, when could we define when the global financial crisis had its impact in Australia? Luckily, there's some previous research which shows quite convincingly that around mid-2009 is when it became really important in Australia. That's when media coverage was at its highest. It's when unemployment was also at its highest. And it's where things like depression, etc., resulting from it were perceived to be at its greatest. So we chose, mid-2009 as our treatment. We looked at wellbeing in 12 domains. These are the 12 domains that are based on kind of a historical legacy of research, kind of roughly around Bob Cummins' work. They date back to the 1970s was the first time that this measure was used. It definitely has some problems, but because the survey organisers decided to keep it as is because they had historical data dating back to 1976, which gives us, lots of nice little things. We had a host of exogenous conditioning variables, so things like gender, Indigenous status, social class, a range of others, a large number of conditioning variables. Harmonisation was a problem. The reason it was a problem is that in the last 10 to 15 years in Australia, the process of academic redshirting has increased. So what this means is that parents are increasingly holding their kids back to the last possible minute before enrolling them into kindergarten. And so the average age of kids in year 9 in the first cohort was 6 to 7 months younger than the average age of year 9 students in the last cohort. So we had to choose, were we going to harmonise on grade in school or age? We chose grade in school, though you'll see later on we also controlled for that using propensity score matching. At this point, it's worth pointing out that there are some limitations of historical data, and Glenn Elder has some really nice chapters on dealing with this. And the large one is that in a lot of these cases that a lot of this data was collected either before I was born, but definitely before I could have any impact on how it was constructed and created. And so I'm having to shape a research question out of things over which I have no control over. Having said that, there is literally zero chance that I as an individual researcher would be able to collect this level of data in this scope. So there's definitely trade-offs. I mean, those that were in my session yesterday, that idea of no free lunches is definitely a case here. Definitely some benefits, but also some negatives. And one of the negatives is that, you know, I think this is kind of a simplistic measure of well-being. I think it works fine for the purposes here. But don't shoot me when you say this isn't well-being. This is all I've got. All right, so what approach did I take? Those of you who know me know that I'm pretty passionate about plotting data, and I think that often the plotting data can show you a lot of things that maybe the statistics miss. And I think that the best display of this in the last couple of years has been Thomas Piketty's book on capital in the 21st century, and he's done an excellent job of using graphical data to make points quite strongly. This one being one of his worst graphs, but gives the idea that you could see that, you know, around the late 1900s, there was a lot of population growth, which offset some of the capital growth, and this might explain why there was a real sense of equality in the 50s and 60s, is his argument, but that we shouldn't expect that equality to continue, but rather that we should expect inequality to expand quite dramatically over the next 100 years. And I think, you know, looking at that graph makes that point quite dramatically. But that's not all I did. And I think this is a modelling approach that's common in econometrics that I don't know that we use much in psychology. The idea is to use a difference in difference approach. And so what we're asking is, if we can have two groups, one who went through a treatment, one who didn't, and we can develop a trajectory of some well-being. So for instance, here we have a control group. Remember, this is all natural experiments, so this is not true random assignment. And we have a treatment group. We can say, we can look at their trajectory on something, and then we have a treatment hit, and we can then look at the difference at the first time point and the second time point, and that gives us the effect of our treatment here. So a difference in difference approach is quite common in econometrics. I don't know if I've ever seen it in psychology. It's actually not all that complicated to use, but I think it's a nice way of thinking about things. But we also use propensity score matching. Propensity score matching was probably better in this approach because it allowed us to harmonise both on grade in school and age, and it provided greater flexibility in analysis. So you'll see here that we have some pretty strong assumptions, right? I mean, we're essentially assuming that the trajectories before the treatment are identical and after the treatment are identical, and that this goes on in either direction. The propensity score matching basically forces that to be the case, and we can you know, take some advantage of lots of other covariates. So I think in this case we used about 3,000 terms in our propensity score matching. So we're controlling on a huge number of you know, interactions, polynomials, etc. So we can really try and get those control groups and treatment groups as close as possible. And as I said, it allowed us to match on age and cohort. So I don't know about you guys. I know that Herb and a few of us have been talking about this, but one of the frustrating things that I found in psychology is that causality is treated as black and white and can only come from randomized control trials, rather than saying that causality is something that we develop evidence for from multiple sources, and that our aim is to try and find ways to use study design to get it to make the strongest possible claims that we can. So while I'm not claiming per se that these are causal effects, what I'm trying to do is to use things like propensity score matching, to use difference in difference models, and to leverage off the strength of the LSAE database to try and make the strongest possible claims that I can. I'm also using a complex survey design here. So those of you that have looked at PISA, you'll notice that there's both population weights and also these things called balanced replication weights. There's 80 of them. So I'm using them here both to control for the weird kind of way in which the data is collected, and also trying to get some population estimates, which I think is pretty important given the claims that I'm claiming to make. So first here is an example of plotting the historical trends. There's 12 of these graphs on the website and a nice little interactive one if that's what you guys like to play with. And you can see here are the 4 cohorts. But what I want to draw your attention to here is the 2 comparisons of interest. The top one there is the age 19 comparison, which is comparing those who are 18 in the year 2010 with those who are 18 in the year 2006. And you see that the trends, this is in general life satisfaction, follow quite closely, and then you see a big gap open up at age 19. And then it closes again, but if you look at the rest of the graph, it then opens up quite dramatically again. And this here is the same thing, but for those who are 22 years of age. So this is one example graph, but you can see the rest, and you can see that it shows quite some interesting trends. I'd love to know what's going on with the 1981 birth cohort, who for some reason were all depressed like crazy at the age of 16, but then seemed to recover. Don't know what happened there. So what I have here is the age 19 comparisons. I have the various domains of well-being in the first column. The second column are the results from propensity score matching. The lights make that incredibly hard to read, I'm sorry. And the final column is the difference in difference. But all I basically want to draw your attention to is the fact that of all of those comparisons, only one was not significant, and that was for satisfaction with money, which is interesting if you think about what I was saying earlier. We'll get to that in a minute. And in all cases, the effects were basically suggesting that the effect of the global financial crisis was quite dramatic. And for social life, general life satisfaction, and oddly leisure time and independence, these effects were getting up to a Cohen's d of about 0.2. So these weren't small effects. These were, I think, given the context of what we're looking at, did a whole population of 19-year-olds drop in well-being, I think these are pretty sizable effects. If we swap over to age 22, we see that the effects weren't as consistently significant. We did some follow-up tests, and there were some places in which they were significantly smaller effects, but not all that often. But what I think is interesting is that, again, the social things were coming up as being those that were pretty heavily hit, but also satisfaction with career prospects was the biggest hit. And I think that's interesting because if at age 22 is about the age where in Australia people finish their bachelor's degree on average, so that people are starting to turn their minds to the end of their apprenticeship, the end of their traineeship, the end of their degree, looking to get careers. And so it seemed that the global financial crisis had a relatively big influence on career prospects in addition to some of the social effects that were going on. Now, I mentioned beforehand that the Labor government at the time gave almost everybody a nice big chunk of money. What was interesting about the LSA data is for some reason they decided to collect, I assume because it's a huge undertaking, and it's all done by telephone, that they collected sets of data every month. So we were able to look at that and to be able to say, well, was there a rise in satisfaction with money, for example, around the time when these government payments started going out? So the payments went out in April 2009, which is the red line. Sorry, the one in the bottom right-hand corner, that the red line has gone wandering. But it's April 2009. And I think for the 19-year cohort, you can see that for the treatment group, there does appear to be quite a big rise in satisfaction with money compared to the control group, those who were 19 in 2006. But I don't think it's all that convincing, right? I mean, because there's kind of big jumps here and there and everywhere. So, maybe there's something there, but I don't find it particularly convincing. And when we move to those who are 22-year-old, I think, again, there's a rise at April, but it's not all that convincing. Maybe something there, but not all of that convincing. There's not a lot of power in this analysis. But, I think my takeaway is that maybe there's something there, but I don't think there's a lot.
Sorry, Phil. You said this is collected over each month, I assume with different participants as cross-sectional?
Correct, yeah. So leveraging off PISA, I think what the design of PISA was to get 15-year-olds, and so they used birthday to ensure that they were literally, getting people at 15, 16, 17, etc., etc. So what are the implications? Okay, yes, I think we can say that the global financial crisis did appear to have an effect on well-being, and I think given the circumstances of what we're looking at, we don't have any data, for example, on individual exposure. So it'd be awesome if we could have had questions in the LSA that asked, did anybody in your family become unemployed? Did you become unemployed? But they didn't have any of that. So the only thing we could really look at was to say, okay, across the population of 19-year-olds in Australia, what was the effect? And I think there was something there. As opposed to what some of the economists have claimed, I think the effect of the cash grants is negligible. And if it does have any effect, the effect is probably going to be domain specific. So satisfaction with money, but not much else. Yes, I think that the global financial crisis did have, my dates have gone wrong here, somewhat larger and more consistent effects in the 19-year-olds than in the 22-year-olds. But again, look, I think there's a couple of things going on here. One is that really those differences weren't statistically significant all that often. And also, what I'm claiming is that the previous birth cohorts in the LSA database, I'm claiming that they are acting as counterfactual cases. And, maybe that's stronger for the 19-year-olds in which the data was collected closer together than for the 22-year-olds. So, the assumption underlying here is that I'm keeping on claiming that previous birth cohorts act as a counterfactual case, and that may be more or less reasonable for the 19-year-olds than the 22-year-olds. Yeah, look, I think that consistent with the research in the UK and the US, social life was relatively largely affected by the global financial crisis, but there was also a lot else going on. Particularly for the 22-year-olds, satisfaction with career prospects declined quite a lot. Yes, I think social life, but not just social life. And I think this is important because previous research has just focused on one domain, so it's looked at the effect on social life, or it hasn't been really able to compare and contrast. Having said that, I think the overwhelming message is that majoritively, if there was an effect of the global financial crisis, it did appear to be consistent across, basically most of the life domains that we measured. I think the one where it was pretty unconvincing was satisfaction with place of residence. So probably unsurprisingly, people didn't become more depressed for having lived in Manly after the global financial crisis. They were still pretty satisfied.
Is that the case for Zara?
So
Singapore then.
So I think that's pretty much it. So take questions.
I couldn't see well enough because of the
Yeah.
But I wonder, as you know, as we talked in the past, the effect sizes are becoming more and more interesting and important to me. How big are they?
So the average effect size is a Cohen's d of 0.1.
Of course.
And that gets up to a Cohen's d of 0.2. Now, you can interpret those in terms of Cohen's d's normal metrics. So these are Cohen's-d in terms of correlations per se, not in terms of, so, using the typical Cohen's-d criteria, those would be small effects. Having said that, I mean, you've got to look at what we're looking at here. So what we're asking is, unmoderated by individual exposure, what were the effects? And so, those Cohen's-d criteria are always meant to be specific to a context. And I think in this context, that's a reasonably important effect size. People might argue with that.
30,000, how many kids? 40,000. So a small effect on 40,000 kids means.
Yeah, that's what I think,
Your suggestion that it generalized across the different life domains, how big was the global component across those life domains? I mean, were the life domains really specific enough so that you had much chance of getting differential effects? Like when we're talking about the self-concept, where you're talking about the math and verbal being uncorrelated, it's easy to get really distinctive. But if you're talking about life domains where the average correlation, corrected for unreliability, which you can't do, was 0.7 or 0.8, then it's hardly surprising that it generalized.
Well, I mean, Bob Cummings' work better than I do. But I think from memory the correlations were high, but they weren't, 0.8-ish or 0.9-ish.
Yeah, but you've got single item ratings uncorrected for unreliability.
Sure, but the content domains aren't all that wide, right? I mean, if you ask people how satisfied are you with your career prospects or whatever,
fair enough.
There can't be that much unreliability.
Phil, that was a fantastic overview and a lovely study. I wasn't living in Australia at the period that you're talking about, but I'm just wondering, was there something else major that was happening apart from the GFC in relation to young people? I mean, was there any change in the education system or social media or anything else that needs to be considered?
I mean, not that I'm aware of. I mean, surely there was, right? I mean, there's some other historical trend, but I mean, I can't pinpoint anything that was as dramatic as that.
Was there an election?
07, so that would have been just prior. And you can actually, so what's interesting is that we're looking at some other research. There's two other questions which didn't happen every year, so I didn't look at them here. They were satisfaction with the state of the economy and satisfaction with the way the country is run. And I've got data dating back to 1976, and you see when the Howard government comes in, the satisfaction with the economy shoots up. But when Kevin Rudd comes in, satisfaction with the way the country is run shoots up. And shoots up quite dramatically more for Indigenous kids than it does for non-Indigenous kids. So I think there's sensitivity to those sorts of things, but I think that the way that the treatment is defined here, that this was after some of the Kevin Rudd gloss had rubbed off. Though, yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I suppose the only thing that I can leverage off is to say that these results are not inconsistent, and in fact pretty strongly consistent with the same findings that the guys from the University of Manchester and Robert Putnam and whatever have been finding in the US and the UK.
Phil, did you look at some of these results in relation to Indigenous versus non-Indigenous free wellbeing?
Not in this case, though I think you're aware that we are looking at in a follow-up study. The rationale was that we were trying to hit a international journal, and it was just easier to not do that. From memory, I don't think the effects were significantly different. And so in the other study we're doing, which is probably now that I've learnt more is probably better, we're trying to disaggregate age, birth cohort and year effects. And essentially what we're finding is, look, there is a significant difference in these wellbeing measures for Indigenous and non-Indigenous kids, but it's tiny. I mean, minuscule. But if you look at year effects, they're quite substantial. And what it seems to be is that when things go bad, it has a bigger effect on Indigenous kids than it does on non-Indigenous kids. So in other words, they're more susceptible to changes in the historical context.
Is that any different than other disadvantaged groups?
No, but my guess is that it would be the same. I mean, my guess is that writing out these things like the global. So, and the global financial crisis is a perfect example, right? So, if we look at in Ireland, Ireland was quite interesting because it had a long history of really strong training and development in organisations, and so there wasn't as strong a culture as everyone going to university as there was. The moment the global financial crisis hit, all of that training and development disappeared. Kids from more advantaged backgrounds segued straight into university and did fine. Kids from disadvantaged populations were unable to as effectively segue into university, and so suffered a whole bunch. And so I think that would be the case. I think just disadvantaged groups in general don't have the same access to things like social capital and cultural capital and the wealth of experience on how to play the system. That means they're not as well protected.
So if you're living on the edge, it's easier to fall off.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm interested also in younger age groups. Did you show what happened to them?
I wish I could, but I don't have the data.
Oh,
I've got the data from. I got the data from 16-year-olds.
Uh-huh.
The problem, so I got the data from 16-year-olds, but I have no pre-treatment data. And for this is the worst thing with secondary data analysis, is for reasons unknown to anybody. ELSA decided that they were going to change the scale from a 5-point scale for wellbeing to a 10-point scale of wellbeing and flip it from 1 being good, 4 being bad, so 1 being bad and 10 being good. So it was, I tried, I just gave up, it was all too hard. I don't know why they did it, it's incredibly frustrating.
So the study only started with 16-year-olds, but focused more on the transition.
So what they did was, this was originally started by ASA, and it was a precursor to PISA. So because ASA took over PISA and
but PISA has a wider age range, doesn't it? No. Oh.
And so
all 15-year-olds.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
So the first time weight in each of these studies is PISA, and then on.
Okay. I mean, I'm asking that question in the context of a study that I think I've mentioned before in Iceland, because they had that horrendous banking crash in 2008, and they were in that strange position that you mentioned at the beginning of happening to have a crash when they had been collecting data anyway.
Yeah.
So they had data from 2007, they had data from 2009 and beyond. And what they found for children, and I don't know up to what age that went, was not only that there was no decrease in their measures of well-being, but there was actually an improvement. And that was linked directly to unemployment of the parents. So when the parents were at home more, the children's well-being went up. And for the group whose parents were not at home, because they had all that data, the well-being went down.
That's quite contrary to the UK one. So the book for the UK is Hard Times by, who's that Guardian journalist? Tom Clark, and so he's written a book summarising the research, and so he found quite the opposite, that the kids suffered a lot. But in the UK also, as you know, there was a lot of this movement to this kind of weird contract work where you were you got a position with, say, McDonald's, but they wouldn't tell you what your schedule for work. You had to always be available, and you might get no work at all for that week. And so it was, without the protections that maybe Iceland's got, it probably was worse in terms of the effects. But so Glenn Elder's famous book, The Children of the Great Depression, talks about that quite a bit. And he found some mixed results. He found that for some, it was a great opportunity for strength. So some of the kids got an opportunity to be treated like adults in a way that they never had before, because they were contributing to the family all of a sudden, going out to work, hopefully not in a coal mine, but somewhere. And were finally feeling like they were being treated with autonomy and respect and whatever in ways that they weren't. So, you know, the consequence for Glenn Elder's book was to say that it's a mixed bag. There's no guarantee that those things are going to be negative. Though in this case, for whatever reason, it seems at least...
But you didn't find any of that in your data, because, I mean, I would have guessed that, I mean, why would leisure time go down if you don't have a job?
I think it's associated with, so it's satisfaction with leisure time, and I think it's associated with, and you know, I'm maybe just pulling this out of nowhere, there seems to be really big social effects in terms of the social dynamic. And so one of the findings from the Hard Times book was that people became isolated during the... They no longer went out. So, you know, there's stories, for example, of people that would have people over for a cake every week, but now they couldn't afford the ingredients and they were so embarrassed that they just wouldn't invite people over anymore. And so there was a lot of anecdotal evidence, but also some economics models to say that people just become isolated. They just sit at home. And so I suspect that that's probably what's going on here, is that for whatever reason the kids just aren't going out as much as what they did. Which, yeah, why not? On a political bent, this is probably the problem with, so during this time was this idea of big society, right? So if we offset money to community groups, people will look after each other during these hard times. And I think some of these research suggests that maybe we should question that. Because I think it suggests that maybe people become... The assumption that people will pull together during hard times and help each other out doesn't seem to be borne out by the data that's come out of the UK, the US and here.
You say you use the propensity score matching to assess the counterfactual research questions. And in this study, do you look at the average treatment effect on treated or just
the average treatment effect? What I'd be desperate for, but I don't. So the thing with the economic things is, so with the global financial crisis, I mean, people at the edge, sure, but everybody shifted down a bit. And so what I really would have liked to have had is individual exposure. So my suspicion would be that those from the upper class who had a big demotion or lost a job or whatever would be just as affected as, you know, some of those in the poor groups that dropped down. But I didn't have any individual exposure variables which would have allowed me to look at that. And I think that's the critical. So I think the effect size is smallish, moderate, because I just couldn't moderate by individual exposure. And one of the points we make in the paper is just to say that, look, you know, I think given these are average treatment effects, this is worrisome, because if we could have moderated by individual exposure, I think that there would have been quite dramatic effects.
Can I come back to something you said at the beginning when you were setting the scene about the effects of gap year? And I think what you said is that the gap year was in many ways disadvantageous because even years down the line there was financial disadvantage in those who'd taken it. But could that be because people who took a gap year had different values and they didn't value, you know, income as much as they valued other things?
Could definitely be. I mean, so the people that wrote that paper, they were from National Institute of Fiscal Studies. So they did it for one of the UK governments, and so they had a lot of data, and they used very extensive propensity score matching. But I can't guarantee that they control for everything. But what the really interesting thing was, right, is that controlling for a lot of the endogenous variables, the kids that took a gap year were actually were more likely to finish with a first-class honours. But even with that additional educational attainment, they were still earning less, not just in terms of like salary, but in terms of hourly wages. So up to 30 and 40, the hourly wages that they were getting were also lower.
But maybe that's a good thing, because maybe they were doing something more meaningful.
Maybe, I don't know. That'd be a long bow to draw. I would doubt it. Maybe, but I would doubt it. I mean, so they're using...
You can look at some of that kind of stuff with your ELSA data. It's far enough along because you've got some. Oh, they don't collect good social. It's not the pizza.
They do have some values, right? I mean, So they used longitudinal study of young people in England and British cohort studies. So I don't know what's in there in terms of values. Do you know? But my guess is that if they did have value measures in there, it would have been part of the matching process.
But I mean, just looking at the kind of occupations they went into. Yeah.
Now have they pushed? I mean, they weren't at the office 90 hours a week, maybe getting promoted.
Right.
I mean, there's no well-being measures with that?
With the cohort studies,
I think there is. Yeah, I don't know the cohort studies.
So could you show that they're making less money, but they're happier, or just
you could.
You said they were matched on
But
the
Sorry?
at the time?
I don't know what they were matched on, but so Jasper and I, our outcome was well-being, and we showed that they were lower, but not significantly so. But given that the purpose that the young people said the reason that they were taking the gap year was to increase their well-being, the fact that they weren't significantly higher and were in fact slightly lower,
during the gap?
pretty damaging.
No.
During the gap?
After the gap year.
Oh, that's interesting.
Okay. So when they re-engaged, or how far down the track was it?
2 years, was it?
2-3 years.
2-3 years, yeah.
So they spent this wonderful time in Paris, and then
Yeah, and they came back and they got miserable to everybody else.
and they came impressed.
And presumably matched for relationships, because that's obviously very important for well-being.
Yeah, we matched for as much as we possibly could.
Yeah,
I think in that case we had close to 10 or 12,000 terms in the propensities. It was huge.
Okay.
And we did it in both Finland and Australia and Finland.
Were they happier while they were doing the gap year? Surely, if they're not happier then.
That was a black box.
I mean, at least if you made it last for a year. And then it's just, because this is averages, they're making less money. But if you could find something that was good, like it was an awesome year, totally.
Except, they don't all go to Paris, right? I mean, the vast bulk of them go and work at McDonald's for a year.
Really?
So my guess would be that they're miserable. I mean, you've taken a year off so that you can recover and everything's going to be fine, and you're working 90 hours over a chip fryer. It's not my idea of paradise.
Now, I heard that you're a big fan of McDonald's. Is that right?
We have to represent McDonald's right there. He said McDonald's,
Phil, did I get you right? You said during the gap year they're doing something as mundane as
Mostly, on average, yeah, they're mainly working, and they're not doing things. On average, they're not doing things like internships or volunteer work. On average, it's usually as simple as.
I thought it would have been travel, recreation.
Well, that's how it's sold.
Yeah.
But if we look at the empirical evidence and ask people what they did.
So is it that the ones who are working at McDonald's are doing so in order to get the money to go to college?
That's not what they say. That's not why they say they're doing it. Maybe they are. Why they say they're doing it is because they wanted to increase well-being, more or less. That they felt like they needed a break and they needed to de-stress and they needed to whatever.
It certainly seemed reasonable.
The big study that I did with high school and beyond, and then Nils, looking at part-time employment during high school, we found that the effects were negative on everything that you could possibly look at, except for one group, and one group that were working to save money to go to university. For them, they had benefits, or at least much lower deficits as a function of the part-time employment.
Remember, so we were doing ours in Australia and Finland where there's no costs in terms of enrolment. So, I mean, it could have actually been different in the US, I don't know.
Well, this was during high school.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, but they were still saving for they were saving for university. I guess the other thing is that Australia is a little different because a lot of the people that work during high school are putting together a potential internship or some sort of thing that will get them into the trades. And that turns out to be much more valuable than almost anything else in terms of...
Well, that's actually the sad thing. So there's a guy called Andrew King who's done a whole bunch of qualitative research on that, and time again the kids would say exactly that. I did this to prepare, to get experience that would help me get a job. but employers don't care about that anymore. They only care about the academic accomplishments. And so that's the thing that is coming.
Well, but if that opens up something to get into a trade so that you can get, then it could be different. But that's a real bottleneck.
Well, there's a huge amount of selection effects, right? So we're moving well away from this, but in terms of gap year, almost all the gap year research is just selection effect, because they say, here's everybody that went to university, and here's those who took the gap year that actually made it back into university, which might only be 20 or 30%, and they're most likely to be the 20 or 30% that are most high functioning. And all of a sudden they're like, wow, look at the effect of the gap year. It's like, yeah, well, if you compare the top 30%.
So your study was comparing the whole cohort? And because I was thinking the ones who select to not go to university because of the reasons you were saying, they're de-stressing, they're a bit overwhelmed, that itself sounds like a selection for negative affectivity, or people who aren't coping very well.
They're better than never returned though. So,
but is that a selection criteria for people who don't cope very well, that aren't very resilient?
Well, we did control for those stress measures, those that were feeling stressed by, more so in the Finnish group than the Australian group, because we didn't have that much data in the Australian group, and in the Finnish group we did have those stress, depression.
But is it one's relationship to the stress? So you have two people who are equally stressed, but one person's like, I'm going to keep going, I know stress is a normal part of my life, I'm going to commit. And another it's like, well, it's too much stress. When I experience stress, I got to just shut down. And
that's your area, dude.
This is a random hypothesis.
I mean, you're coming into like the biggest debate in developmental psych, right? So in developmental psych, everybody's talking about emerging adulthood and isn't this wonderful? And then Uta Heckhausen is saying, well, no, it's not. The thing that's wonderful is staying on track. Keep staying on track. Do not divert. That is the best pathway through. And so the big fight at the moment is this emerging adulthood a wonderful thing or a terrible thing?
Did you say that the average age per grade has gone up by 6 months through academic redshirting?
It's probably partially redshirting. It's probably partially the way that, because ACE changed the way they collected the data from the first cohorts to the second lot of cohorts. So I mean, who knows? I think redshirting is probably part of it. But I think also maybe study design a little bit was part of it as well.
What does the term redshirt
Yes, what does it mean?
It's a U.S. sporting term,
rookie.
When you're first year of university, you have a certain number of years of eligibility, and if you don't take that up, you have that year. You can do the fifth year, and so that's called redshirting.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I mean that's exactly. And so it's the idea of like parents think that if they hold their kid back as long as possible, then they'll be more cognitively developed. They'll be bigger, they'll be musclier.
Sure, definitely. I can say that.
Yeah.
Except that the effects of redshirting are pretty ambiguous. I mean, the research that's been done doesn't suggest it's all that great.
Well, the year in school effect that I did is pretty strong. It generalized across all the PISA countries.
That's a self-concept, but not for everything. So this is,
I thought there was a lot of evidence that kids who were older in their year did better than the kids who were younger in their year, even academically and socially.
The weird thing is it depends on which field you're in. So if you go to economics, almost all of the economics research is bad. So,
but hockey, wasn't there studies of hockey players who were the older the pros were more likely to be the red-shirted, basically the ones who started older. Yeah.
But part of that, right, is that red-shirting isn't just a treatment effect. It's also upper-class parents that think they're savvy and know how to play the system. Right? So, I mean, it could be red-shirting, or it could be social capital, cultural capital.
Yeah.
But we're over time, eh?
Thank you.
Thank you.